Welcome to Fockers, the go-to place for all things fully on-chain games. Today I have with me Awtnmy, the founder, and Jaymo, the product manager, representing Archetypal Game Studio and Oregon fully on-chain game. What's up, guys?
How we doing?
Hey, how's it going?
Oregon is a nostalgic, weird twist on the classic trail adventure, equal parts Oregon Trail homage and experimental fiction machine, all inscribed fully on-chain forever. It's great to have you guys, and I just want to say that this speaks to my fanfiction alter ego deeply. Maybe we'll hit that later. I don't know if I actually told either of you, but I used to be quite deep in a specific fanfiction community when I was like a mid-teen, let's say like that.
Then you're our perfect target audience.
Yeah. So I'm curious, did I describe the game well? I tried to be brisk, but I'm curious how you describe it at this point, Oregon specifically.
That's great. As you said, it is an homage to the games of the 80s and 90s that Jay and I both grew up learning computers on. But also it's this experimental fiction machine. The whole driving thought was not, hey, let's make something nostalgic or let's make a game that reminds of our childhoods, but what type of game can we make that will be flexible enough and easy enough to prototype and implement rapidly around to create a user-generated content platform or fiction machine. So the aesthetic was driven by the ambition, if that makes sense.
Okay. I'm curious if that's also the way that you describe it both to your traditional gaming peers, but also to your friends in the fully on-chain game space, or do you have some differences in terms of how you approach the explanation?
Yeah, I tend to like learning from how we speak to the layman to make sure that we don't just go straight into jargon. So actually, generally speaking, if I'm speaking to someone who is not in the on-chain games world, doesn't understand this stuff, I talk about a text adventure where players can tell stories for each other. I reference games like Sleep is Death by Jason Rora, which is a fairly niche but fairly famous indie game from the mid-2000s, where it was like a game where it's two players. One player is the player having the experience, the other is the games master or dungeon master using a little tile-based editor to lead their friend around an interesting story. Yeah, the kind of difference there for how we then go and speak to people who are more au fait with blockchains is usually just the fact that we get to cut the middleman out with the blockchain, right? Like, we're not going to be escrowing money. If people are going to make user-generated content for each other or expand the world for each other, they get to do that directly as peers.
Yeah, the fully on-chain nature definitely lends itself to allowing that permissionlessly. And I'm assuming that many of the listeners understand why interactive fiction was chosen as the starting point for this. But can you just explain why start with interactive fiction?
Yeah, I'll do a little top level, but I think Jay is the person that I'd like to get to expand on this because it's his realm of expertise. My initial starting point was literally, how do we make something small, quick, and easy for people to add to? The kind of phrasing that we used early on was the most composable things we have are words. So if you want to make composable worlds or composable games, then you really want them to be built out of words, not out of graphical things. And we just started playing with that, like, how do you model a system where things can be pieced together easily? We didn't actually originally want to make a real kind of physical editor, like a UX based or a UI based, editor. We thought, oh, we'll just use config files and people just go in and edit in the way that you did games in the DOS era, which is just find the files that you could have access to and had human readable data in. But it very quickly evolved out into actually you could componentize this stuff and make something that felt a little bit more like a text adventure engine. So it's evolved very quickly. And there are lots of really good examples of interactive fiction editors out there, like Twine and Inform 7, but many of them actually haven't really been pushed forward for 10 or 15 years. And so it also felt like a good opportunity to revisit that and revitalize the movement around how people make creating interactive fiction easier for the people interested in doing so.
Jaymo, do you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'm a massive interactive fiction nerd, and in some of my other work around like designing worlds and systems as worlds, like I often point to the development of interactive fiction and its influence on computing in general, because you get Dungeons and Dragons in 1974, and then you get Zork in 1976, and then by 1978 MUD is running on mainframes, and we have fully multiplayer MMOs. Essentially 4 years after the invention of Dungeons and Dragons, we have MMOs and virtual worlds that people are running around inside of based in text. And a lot of the design assumptions that you get from that sort of sequence of events flows out into how people think about identity and inventories and even UX in multiplayer software, let's just say, in general. There's other antecedents to that. There's like other games on the Plato mainframe and so on and so forth. But one of the things that really struck me is that I came across the autonomous world space really early on and was at the Zero X Park's October 2022 unconference, which I was invited to because of my work in worlds and writing. And we were all there talking about blockchains as a computational substrate, etc., that you can build on, and building games on machines. And it's the first kind of games that were built on mainframes were text adventures. So it just seems obvious that if history is repeating itself in terms of transaction speeds 3 years ago were very similar to the kinds of transaction speeds you would have got on a DEC PDP mainframe running a dial-up MMO in the 1980s, like before the web. So it just seemed obvious to me that if we're reinventing the wheel, then we should go through the same we should go through the same sequence of events before we get to graphics. We should nail the text, because the other thing worth mentioning is that text-based interactive fiction games are an absolute hotbed of cutting-edge games design, some of which can only be done in text, and also mechanics that get more complicated when you start adding graphics. And there's all sorts of just amazing designers that have been involved in interactive fiction, Emily Short and so on and so forth over the years. And yeah, the interactive fiction, just to tie this off, interactive fiction, parser-based interactive fiction, let's say, which is what we have built with a Ruggin, kind of fell off in the early 2000s when Twine came out so people basically moved from writing parser-based interactive fiction, pick up gold bar, go north, go west, and started building hypertext worlds, which have slightly different affordances. And lastly, just to say, in our current era with the release of AI, everybody is now talking to their computers again in natural language, and it just feels perhaps it's time to go back, return to tradition, and explore the parser-based interactive fiction space. That's one of the motivating factors of building this game for me, anyway.
Yeah,
that's super cool. I can definitely feel that you love kind of like nerding out about this specific topic, Jaymo.
That's why we love him.
Awesome.
An absolute goldmine.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that lend towards utilizing interactive fiction. One of them, as you mentioned, is just the fact that the affordances of the blockchain for developing fully on-chain games, like Ruggin is, have been progressively getting better, right? There's more and more things we can do with it, but I definitely see many of the builders in the space treat it as almost speedrun in what's possible with the realm of fully on-chain games. And interactive fiction is definitely one of the early blocks of where we might end up at some point. And you also mentioned that game design is something you can rapidly prototype with in this specific space of interactive fiction, because you don't really have to worry about like a high fidelity graphical interface or something. What you're working with is a black screen and text. And that's the beauty of it.
And people's brains. This is the bit that I think people forget, is the imagination of your audience is such a key component in this gameplay loop. One that isn't allowed for when you have everything being rendered for someone. And Jay was getting at, actually, that's where lots of this more innovative game design can come from, because you can take words that have two meanings and do something very interesting by transforming the player's appreciation or understanding of what they're experiencing flipping it on its head all of a sudden, because there's no graphics or physics stopping you from doing so. So like Jay referenced Emily Short earlier, what is the game that she has where you are changing the words with this like word altering machine called? Do you remember?
Counterfeit Monkey.
Yep. Counterfeit Monkey is a really good example, because effectively you are going around this world and you have this device that can change the, like, you switch the device to which letter it's targeting in the what objects in the world around you, and you can change the word or remove a letter or add a letter, and it means that the objects in the world can be transformed immediately based on just changing their spelling.
So for example, you change beard to bear, and that becomes a different object in the world, and then you can change bear to ear. The game is just so creative and it's just bursting with possibility, and it's the sort of thing that you can do. Like Scribblenauts is an example in the graphical realm, right, where you like draw the thing and then it pops into the world. It has a similar flavor. Something that we might come back to a bit later is that words are extremely cheap and fluid. When you're working in games, you have a lot of possibility for rapid prototyping.
Yeah. And that's something that I experienced as well. And this is something I did mention to you, I think, is that I built my own text adventure game as the finishing project for my informatics class in high school before heading into computer science. And it was a very simple, you enter a cave and you're immediately faced with picking up one of 3 different weapons, and that really sets you off on this kind of 20-30 minute adventure. It was most definitely like a switch case haven, very deeply nested decision trees. I didn't know my way around functions back then, so it was a lot of copy paste. I remember trying to modifying that code was not slick, let's say it like that. And
that's really funny. The first thing that I ever programmed and completed on computer was in 1999 in Visual Basic. I made an interactive fiction game. Was super proud of the fact that it had an inventory and I could calculate the number of coins that was in the wallet and have objects and stuff. I think it's one of those things that, despite the progress and the current state of the gaming industry, interactive fiction, because it's so core to the history of computing, not even games, it's so core to the history of computing itself, is something that people, regardless of how old they are, they come back to again and again.
Yeah.
And it's a rite of passage for all those reasons. Like, to do the 3 out of 3 here, like my experience, like on my games programming BSc, we had to write our own engines in C++ because I'm that old and Unity hadn't really gotten that much traction at the time. But it meant writing a text adventure in C as one of the first ports of call before we got on to trying to integrate graphics and audio management and networking tools and stuff like that. It straight away, I think most people, if you get into making things with computers, you're engaging with the command line, and the command line naturally lends itself to, I can, instead of navigating file structures, I can navigate rooms. Yeah,
exactly. At the beginning of Zork, it says that the parser itself speaks to you and says, I will be your hands, eyes, and ears. And the parser in the command line is the world in some sense. And even just thinking about that philosophically is super interesting when it comes to designing interactive fiction worlds.
Yeah, there's something very inviting to being able to do pretty much anything when it comes to unique game design and spinning that up from 0 to 1, as opposed to, I remember my peers in high school where some of them would make an advanced calculator app, or they would make something like a Minesweeper, but they were locked in to what they were working on, the game design or the calculator functions. It's already preset. But with the text-based adventure, I could just go into whatever topic, whatever kind of niche utility for a certain item. I could just whip it up. I remember I even had a book growing up that was essentially a text-based adventure. It would tell you, okay, if you pick this up, go to page 200. And then on page 200, you had different optionalities. I think this is really a gold mine of things. Even just to inspire you as a game designer, you should be playing stuff like that, I think. And
in the book that I'm writing, I make the case that the existence of choose your own adventure books primed an entire generation for 5 years later as they grew up to understand how hypertext works. It's really funny. And interestingly, choose your own adventure books, the very first ones, actually predate telephone phone trees. So you like when you ring your bank and it says press 1 to go here, press 2 to go here. Like the logical concept of being able to navigate a phone tree is actually after the invention of interactive interactive novels, which I think is super fascinating. Do you know what I mean? Isn't that so crazy? Automated assistance is the technical term for those phone trees.
Yeah, all things echo back to
Sure do.
things, games. It's very cool. Now, of course, there are specific technological hurdles or ideas that come with building interactive fiction, but specifically with putting it all on chain, the engineering hurdles that come with building a fully on-chain game, specifically with Dojo and Starknet, as you guys are doing. Maybe you can bring me through how did you even approach building this out? Who were some of the people maybe that were instrumental in helping you understand maybe a pattern shift, even like when it comes to designing the architecture of the entire project? It is very specific, right?
Yeah, and constantly evolving as well. So to see a kind of relatively condensed timeline on this, we have made several different prototypes of a text adventure in some shape or form, and its ability to be edited across multiple different frameworks. And like one of the reasons, again, harking back to the first question that we started on text adventures, was because I actually started writing smart contracts in Rust on CosmWasm when doing some testing on Celestia before Celestia launched, because a good friend of mine is one of the founders of Celestia. And at the time, each transaction that you submitted had to be 100 bytes or less. And I was like, oh, really? What am I going to do here? I had no idea. My kind of games experience is sort of compression of much larger things into still much larger things. And so that experience made me take a step backwards. We then went and played around with a couple of different things. I got to meet Scott Sonato, who was making a thing called World Engine at the time with Celestia. We prototyped on his platform. We prototyped in Mud, which is the lattice fully on-chain game engine, the guys who ran the, I guess, meetup. How would you describe the thing that Jay was talking about from October 22, the first autonomous
that
world
was
meetup?
the very first. It was an unconference, really. Everyone was talking about the possibility of building on-chain games and building worlds on-chain, and what new affordances would we get from building on-chain, which we get. We can talk about it later, but we get from that everybody knows now. But we get lots of things to do with the database and identity that weren't possible before in interactive fiction games. But yeah, it was an unconference, and there was really early presentations at that conference about just the really early Merkle tree indexes and stuff like that. It was really early doors before.
And in a strange sort of collective unconscious manner, that was exactly the time that I was doing the modular fellowship at Celestia and starting to play around with this stuff. And completely unbeknownst to me, Jay was just down the road in North London with these guys hammering this stuff out. And it turned out that a bunch of the guys came from that unconference and built the first fully on-chain games engine that supported a concept of worlds called Mud. So we jumped into prototyping with Mud in Solidity and on EVMs, and we continued to still struggle with how to go about this stuff until we got to know Terrence and the guys over at Cartridge and what they were building out with Dojo. And now, in terms of what you can actually essentially turn into proofs and compress to be fully on-chain, is just wildly different than it was in 2022. But the principle still remains in that you're not going to put lots of visuals and imagery on chain. It's the logic that you're putting on chain. And if your game is a text adventure, you are putting all of your game on chain because it's purely logic. So from that perspective, it's been a roller coaster up and down all over the place, trying to work out how to do these things. And I can't say that we necessarily worked it all out yet either. Now, it still feels like we're in experimenting with how these architectures work. We've done lots of building things and throwing things away. We've done major refactors. We've had prototypes where it was all far too deeply coupled, and then we've had to do major refactors where we put something like the Shinigami pattern in place in order to separate business logic from data. We've then also realized that's not necessarily going to do all of the heavy lifting for us, and we've got to think differently because a language like Cairo is constantly evolving as we go. So the process is basically constantly changing and being aware of what you can and can't do and boxing cleverly around it, I think.
And if we talk specifically about the places, ecosystems, networks that people are building fully on-chain games in, for example, the last two interviews that I published, like this week and last week, one person was building on the Sui L1 using the Walrus data layer, and the other one is a dark forest fork that I understand is running on Berachain. I'm curious, in your mind, why is Starknet and Celestia the tools of choice for you and where you've ended up being?
There's an easy answer for this that doesn't require going into the technical depth, which is that to a degree, there's a lot of people making wild claims out there in the blockchain space, and you can only really rely on the people at the end of the day and whether you have confidence in what they are capable of delivering. And so for me, like, I avoided doing stuff that, like, as we've talked about before, run a game studio for over 11 years. I've been adjacent to blockchain for a large part of that, but how and when I chose to combine games and blockchain was very delayed because it felt a lot of overblown promises and a lot of sharks in the water. But Mustafa was getting somewhere with Lazy Ledger in sort of 2018 or 2019, and he and I started chatting about what the actual use cases for games could be. And I was like, Mus is a smart guy. I know he's going to make something interesting. I would like to try and build on it. And that was the way that I jumped in. It didn't come about from some massive spreadsheet analyzing the available frameworks. It came from trust. And the same thing goes with Dojo. I was very confident in the team that Terrence had assembled and the skills that they had and their ability to deliver. And they've continued to do so. It's people at the end of the day. That's why we choose the frameworks and tools that we build on, because they move so fast that you need to know that the people are there capable of shifting with it.
And of course, we've talked a bit about the unique affordances that fully on-chain brings to the game design you're looking to experiment with and bring out. Maybe you can actually walk me through in terms of the years that you've spent now thinking about fully on-chain and the different just games that you've been prototyping and the path to Awtnmy from a game design perspective. So specifically talking about how fully on-chain caters to the game design you were looking to bring out. And also, how did that path lead to basically at some point having probably like a eureka moment where you realized Awtnmy was not just a game, but effectively an editor?
Yeah, okay. As a studio, we, both for our clients and in our own work, have always been hired to do stuff around user-generated content. So we have built a lot of educational games and a lot of training games in the past. And one of the core parts of that has either been making sure that the end user has an editor or some flexibility so that a maths teacher in a classroom can change the curriculum quickly or even change a class lesson plan on the fly with the kids in the classroom with them, through to one of the things that Jay and I were working on most recently was taking the modding tools from a game made for pure entertainment by us about hackers and hacker culture, and used our own modding tools to prototype it into an actual training platform and training environment for cybersecurity. So at the core of everything that we've done has always been this drive to make sure that user-generated content and user-generated content tooling is at the core of it so that we can move quickly and our players can contribute to things easily. That's played out in multiple different prototypes that we've done over the course of the last few years that we've been in and out of making on-chain games. The biggest realization was we knew we wanted to make something, and this starts all the way back in the Modular Fellows days. We had this notion of a thing called Bridge Builder, where we wanted to create this large-scale UGC network where people interested in world building would be able to find each other and commission each other to extend each other's worlds, and using effectively like the blockchain as the provenance record. It was too big as an idea, and like one of the things that Jay helped summarize is Bridge Builder is a thesis rather than a product. But around about the same time, late last year, we realized that actually we should be thinking about making the Awtnmy Trail, this text adventure, have some of those principles in it. So we finally bit the bullet and went, why don't we try building an adventure editor and then give players who create content the ability to extend that with the allowances and affordances of blockchain. So whether that's the ability to commission each other or the ability to be rewarded autonomously or automatically for their contributions based on when players pay for content somewhere else, distributing treasuries, and then eventually, which Jay will touch on later with some of the future vision, like even taking some of the kind of money Legos building blocks that folks in blockchain like to talk about and applying DAO structures and tooling to those worlds.
But to begin with, we wanted to make a game and we ended up making an editor, a visual editor, so we could make the game that we wanted to make. Like, ultimately, I think that's one of the core reasons why we ended up building an editor for ourselves, is that rather than, as Rich was saying earlier, editing the whole thing at the command line and config files and stuff, that we ended up building a nice web page and an editor, which is still pretty much like internal tools UX level at the moment. But one of the reasons why we're going to be putting Oregon out is that we want to get it into the hands of people and see what they think. And there's many UX passes still to be done on the editor, but we're quite happy with its capabilities and where it's sitting right now, which is why we're putting the game out.
Yeah, 100%.
And the way that the editor, from my understanding, actually sparks into motion how a player is able to get their hands on the actual editor is that after finishing the game, after going through the story and coming to the end, that's where you get the option to actually edit and remix the entire story. And you get to see full affordances of blockchain. Everything is modifiable permissionlessly. And then you can send tokenized save files to other people for them to play it. And then when your friend will go through and finish your unique story, they get the chance to again modify, remix it.
Yeah.
I think this is a very, very interesting kind of point that I'm seeing in some of the games, in the fully on-chain games utilize. For example, Loot Survivor is one, right? I believe that you're also using some of the tech that they've developed to actually bring this out. And Loot Survivor specifically, you just send a save file and then people can continue playing from that moment in the dungeon. There's another one, and this is the one that I mentioned on Sui, it's called Vendetta. And they're actually also inspired by Torn. I think you guys mentioned Torn at some point. So tokenized save files. To me, this is one of the things that I'm very excited about to see in action in the next few years. It seems very clear to me that this is one of the blocks that games that want to bring out a lot of interesting things from fully on-chain should utilize. So just before we dive into Oregon itself and the narrative of it and the game design that's involved there, let's start with that. Let's start with the tokenized game saves. How does that work?
So, like you mentioned, we have built into the pattern and the systems that Provable Games, the Loot Survivor creators, built out. And the notion there is something called the Embeddable Game Standard that they've been working on, which is effectively that every game is a token and can be embedded as a token somewhere else. And their starting point for this was their adventurers are effectively the character that you throw into a dungeon is a token and represents your progress throughout. And if you play halfway through the dungeon, you can send your adventurer over to someone else as a token, as an ERC 720 transfer, and they are going to be able to pick up and continue on. And like you just said, we found that to be a really interesting kind of concept, right? Like it opens up quite a lot in terms of design space for you. If you're mapping someone's progress, you're able to map someone's achievements, which means you can also map whether they've completed something and what do you want to unlock with the completion of a thing. And like we were always going to try and, although it's going to be somewhat in the realm of the permissionless, as you've alluded to, you do want to give people scope and bounds in which to operate. So we're not going to give you the ability to edit the world immediately. We're going to give you the ability, once you've proved your worth by completing the journey down the Arugin Trail, or effectively learnt the mechanics of the game by proving that you can get through it. So in our case, that achievement means that this token becomes your key, your pass to the editor. And the way we have it set up is that effectively anyone who then completes the run through of the story side of the game gets to write their own trail. So the game is in 3 acts. That you start off as this character. I won't give too many spoilers away, but you start off with this character who effectively needs to put a party together and gather the gear in order to head down the Arugin Trail. And there's a set of staging grounds that you have to get to, and that's Act 1. And the idea is once anyone has completed all 3 acts and completed the game, they will be able to start their own trail. We generate an exit for them from the staging grounds, and they can build any story, any set of rooms, and anything that's built in the editor, you've connected your controller wallet to. Your wallet address gives you the ownership over any component room object from that point onwards, and then we can use that to track who's added to the world and also what people have chosen to do to build off of each other's worlds.
And at what point does the player get the ability to, let's say, mint new playthroughs of the campaign that they've remixed? Are you able to just start new game and then that's like
Yep.
a new token?
Yep, exactly. It's just as easy as start new game. And at the moment, it's all there as a free entry point. Loot Hero over at Provable Games is doing something interesting with something that's not pay what you want, but pay what other people want, which is he's using a Kubo to do this clever financialized assessment of supply and demand for his game, and then setting the price based on that. So I think we might follow down that line and toy with that experiment based on how it comes out. But yeah, you just mint a new game to play it. There's no limitation on how many games you play. You just have to pay for the game in some way, shape or form in order to do.
Now, if we talk about the unique affordances of on-chain narrative design, you already mentioned earlier the fact that everything here is, you can permissionlessly utilize any already existing like blockchain entity out there, and this can be in forms of DAOs, different tokens, even like unique contracts that people have made, like proposals, like the world's your oyster, NFTs. You can very simply integrate all of this into the narrative of what you're working with.
We're starting to talk in future terms now, rather than what we've talked about so far is all stuff that's in there and we'll be rolling out over the coming weeks. So the starting point of the soft launch is to get people playing the adventures and feeding back as to how they experience an on-chain adventure. Then we'll start to roll out access to this very early prototyped set of editor tools so that players can teach us what they need or want out of writing their own stories in this format. And then it gets into the theoretical when we jump into this notion of integrating tooling and things along those lines. But yes, that moves into intention rather than what's there yet, as a clarification. An example that may well actually be achievable in the now, which is that when you use the editor and you create a new set of rooms or areas to have a player navigate through, or even an object in that room, we associate a wallet address with those objects and who published them. That wallet can be a multi-sig. That wallet can be run by a group in a Discord and have someone who is allocated the executive permission to execute those transactions. Some of the kind of coolest stuff about the way that crypto operates is the human level side, right? And like once you have a wallet and ownership, like how communities decide to go and innovate with that is out of our hands and beyond our kind of imaginations to a degree. But yeah, an example would be a DAO can basically build their extension of the Arugin world or their own world eventually, because the idea is that this editor suite will take on a life of its own in the long run outside of Arugin Trail. And they can collaboratively make those decisions, and they can have a committee or a multi-sig or a DAO-like structure or an EIP type process to vote and do governance on how their world is built and extended and who has permission to do.
And I think this is also the moment when even economical factors come into play, potentially, whether you like it or not. Everything is tradable. And I'm curious, Jaymo, what you specifically see here as a big fan of kind of like the interactive fiction space, a long-time consumer as well. what draws you to even want to build here?
One of the things that is interesting about the tail end of the interactive fiction, it's not to say that it's dead, because there are plenty of people making interactive fiction games all the time, and I highly recommend everyone check out the yearly Interactive Fiction Game Awards on the IF archive, because there's still loads of really cool innovation happening. But there's a book called the IF Theory Reader that came out in the early 2010s, which was the very tail end of like when it was like a very big movement in games design still, before new games designers moved over to Twine, as I mentioned before. And one of the things that they're talking about in that book is, how do we do multiplayer interactive fiction? How do we do economies? How do we do persistent world state? And all of these questions that we know from the fully on-chain game space, is we get all of that out of the box, basically, from using the blockchain as a shared ledger to define the world state. Although the Oregon and our editor is still early doors, one of the things that we're doing is that we're now building on this new, essentially like multiplayer substrate that has a lot of affordances, like going forwards with different kinds of games designed. So for example, like one of the ideas that I have personally that I'd like to use the editor for is to build something a bit like, I don't know if you played Dead Zone Rogue, which is a first-person game set on a space station, and you go into the space station and you open doors and you pick up objects and you move them around, and when you die, you respawn at the beginning, but the world is the same because you're constantly like respawning inside of the space station. And the idea is that each run you get a little bit further because it's a rogue, because you've opened doors and so on and so forth. And I'd like to build a collaborative multiplayer game where people maybe only have so many transactions and to get through the game. So you have 1,000 moves or you have 100 moves, and then but each time someone plays it and leaves a door open for the next player, they can get a little bit further, and then at the end, maybe everyone who helps solve a puzzle for someone else gets an NFT. Or there's all sorts of things that we can do in that space. I'm not sure if I actually answered your question.
Take on from there, because the kind of extension to that is the economics of it. If you see lots of activity and lots of people collaborating to complete a thing or to enjoy an experience, then it has some perceived value, right? And then it's just a question of how it's monetized, as to whether that value is extractable or if it's purely shared by a community in a moment. And that can be done well and that can be done terribly, and anywhere in between. The interesting thing when you create a UGC structure where you have provenance over who owned and who contributed to what bits of it, and especially if you're allowing a community to do governance around that, is that if some form of vibe or success or traction starts to occur, then people, if they wish to, can speculate on the potential of that vibe or the potential of that traction or the potential of that world. And because the games themselves are tokens and the tracking of their kind of contributions are all done with wallets, that potential can be traded if you want, right? If someone wants to sell their piece of UGC, they can sell that token. If someone wants to sell their entire world, or if a community wants to step away from something, that they can do, and it doesn't require the transfer of a limited company or some broader legal structure, because it's got this interesting concrete tokenized basis that you wouldn't have if the game was just built on conventional servers.
Yeah, I think this really beautifully wraps up why I'm also excited about this specific genre seeing the light of day connected to fully on-chain games. And if we had another hour or two, we could talk about many other things, including how potentially the fan fiction community could absorb this, because that's something I was very interested in, specifically for the Percy Jackson universe. When I was like 13, 14, I was part of many different subreddits, participating in literally like text-based role-playing. And I think permissionless fan fiction, where it's very simple to understand who contributed what to the story. And if the fan fiction does end up blowing up, being able to transparently understand who to reward for what, that's a major point, right? But that's like another topic for another day.
Yeah. I mean, it's interactive is the key word though, right? Interactive fiction. We could just close this out for like just talking like real future facing. like grand plans, but first we need to get Oregon launched and have people playing it. One of the things that I've observed being in this space for so long now is that many projects begin with novel game mechanics around building on the affordances of a blockchain. But if the games use visuals and require Unity and so on and so forth, like, we can start building the game now and we can play it in 2027. Whereas, as I said before, interactive fiction games are extremely cheap and fluid. So if you have a novel currency mechanism that you want people to try out, or if you want to prototype new mechanisms around DAO governance or so on and so forth, placing it inside of an autonomous world has been the promise from the very beginning. But doing everything in text means that we can prototype and iterate extremely rapidly, and I think that's where we want to go. If listeners can find my talk from DevConnect in Turkey a couple of years ago, where I was talking about myth-making mechanisms in autonomous worlds, or I explain how law is essentially generated inside of worlds that unfold mechanistically. And in that, I was talking about how we can move beyond the management of material that isn't a treasury or a currency. Like, how do we, inside of a text-based world, or a multiplayer one, how do you collectively come to decisions about what is and isn't part of the world or the law? And we can start to develop these new mechanisms, whether it's voting or however many people play it, or there's all of these things that we can experiment with. And I'm excited to do that. And with just how good LLMs have got, whose natural language is text, like, we can rapidly build smart contracts that have new techniques for managing things, or like DeFi economies and so on and so forth, and fill the worlds full of LLMs and see how those particular design patterns play out. It's exciting, and yeah, we're stoked.
So there's two things that you can follow up with us on a follow-up call on. Maybe we can, like, in a couple of weeks' time, when you've had a chance to play the game and it's out and we've got players contributing and toying around, you can have us back and we can jump into the kind of application to fan fiction and the broader extension into the world of LLMs and AI, because we haven't even started to touch on that and the integrations that we have lined up for how large language models and natural language processing ties into text adventures and what we're doing with our own.
I really think that's the beauty. That's the beauty of text adventures, right? As we mentioned many times here, you can do anything you want in there. It's also why I was drawn to do it in high school. It's so simple to build, but the full potential of it is just extremely immense, especially for prototyping unique game design and whatnot, as opposed to like shipping a whole high fidelity thing. As the very last
simple to build is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, I was talking about non-fully on-chain. Only there's switch and if case statements and you're there. Now, the last question I always ask on these interviews is, can you explain Oregon in 2 sentences?
Yes. I'll let Jay go first, though.
A darkly satirical adventure paying homage to the original Oregon Trail, filled with on-chain memes and many things that people who spend a lot of time on crypto Twitter will recognize.
There you go. Yeah. And I would just say it's an on-chain text adventure where players can eventually write the story for each other, building around games like Papers, Please and the Oregon Trail as its basis.
There we go.
Yeah, it comes out next week in its soft launch form. So if any of your listeners are interested, please do come and join in and help give feedback and test the game out with us. We're keen on seeing what they think of playing a text adventure in this sort of on-chain format. It is just a soft launch. It's in a sort of testnet, devnet state, but the whole point is to get people in and interacting nice and early. So from Monday next week, the 29th, which I don't know whether this will be out by then, but if it is already, then please do come and jump in and join us. You can find our socials on Twitter. You can join. We've got a very nascent brand new Discord that we're starting to direct people to for starting to chat in, and we've also got an area you can sign up with an email address for notifications to your inbox.
We'll make sure to leave some links in the post.
Brilliant.
But
Thank you.
this was great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.